Welcome to day 3 of Jesus Today, the events of the last week of Jesus' life during Holy Week. It's Wednesday, and today Jesus is doing more of what he has been doing, which is teaching, but the story evolves a little bit. We get a backroom conversation. It starts in Luke chapter 21, the very last 2 verses of chapter 21 into the first 6 verses of chapter 22. So let's start in verse 37 of chapter 21. It says this, "And every day he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and lodged on the mount called Olivet. And early in the morning all people came to him in the temple to hear him." That's both a statement of what Jesus did all week long, but it's also the start of Wednesday morning. And it just tells us that one of Jesus' last desires was to teach. He wanted to prepare people for the kingdom of heaven. And so that's what he's doing. But on this Wednesday, it's not so much about what Jesus did. It's about the things that were happening to Jesus. And in chapter 22, we go from the public ministry of Jesus teaching every day, but we go to a backroom conversation between the religious leaders and then with Judas. And Wednesday is the day that the betrayal happens. Wednesday is the day that the plans are made. Wednesday is the day that the crucifixion and all the events that are about to come begin to roll into place. And so chapter 22, verse 1 through 2, it says this, "Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called the Passover, and the chief priests and scribes were seeking how to put him to death, for they feared the people." So the Passover's coming. We know that. They've been buying their lambs, buying their sacrifices. Passover is in under 24 hours from now. And so Passover is on Thursday night. We are just one day from Passover. So Passover is drawing near, and what's happening in the back room? Jesus is preaching, teaching publicly. In the back room, the chief priests and religious leaders, the scribes, are wondering, how can we kill him this weekend? How can we get rid of him? And what's interesting about how this comes about is it says, "For they feared the people." So they were in back rooms talking about it, trying to make plans because they feared what the public would do. They feared what the people would do. They feared how the people would respond. And so they're trying to make these backroom deals. And I just think, man, how much wrong has happened in the world and in our lives, and proven by the crucifixion because of fear, because of the fear of people, because we're afraid of being seen, being known. We're afraid of losing reputation. Every lie is out of fear of man and fear of people. Every compromise is out of fear of man and fear of people. And how many people, and maybe you know some of them, how many people have rejected Jesus out of fear of what others would say, out of fear of what others think of them, out of fear of how it would impact their job and their everyday life. This is the same sin in all of us, that the fear of man will never produce the worship of Jesus. And so they're afraid of people. They're afraid of what people will do. They're afraid of how people are going to respond. And so they're making these plans in secret. And Jesus is crucified ultimately because of the fear of people. Think about that. Think about how big the fear of man resides in us. And that is the thing that sent Jesus to the cross. It is the fear of man that leads us to question and to reject Christ. And then it goes on, takes this fear that they have, and look what happens in verse 3. "Then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he consented and sought an opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of a crowd." Here's what's amazing. It says Satan entered Judas. That gives us some big questions. How does somebody who walked with Jesus, somebody who knows Jesus, somebody who had a relationship with Jesus ultimately get filled with Satan? And I think this is the weightiness of this passage. One is that the chief priests, they had their desires. Judas obviously had his desires for money and for power and fame or reputation or whatever that looks like. Obviously, they had their issues, but behind those desires is this mastermind enemy of Jesus, which is Satan, the father of lies, the angel that was kicked out of heaven, tried to be God, wanted to make himself like God. And you have Jesus, although was God, did not think that the glory of God was something to be grasped after, but became a servant unto death. You see the big difference between Satan and Jesus. And here Satan enters Judas. This is the great mastermind behind their desires. So the chief priests, they had their motivations. Judas had his motivations. But behind all of that is Satan knew how to use their temptations and their motivations against Jesus. And so then here you have Judas conferring with the chief priest. You have Judas intentionally giving himself to the work of Satan. You don't just go out and trip on the road and all of a sudden Satan enters you. That's not how it works at all. It's if God does not live in the heart, someone else, something else will live in the heart. That's how it goes, right? If our heart is a home and Jesus doesn't reside in that home, we're told in the scriptures in the story that Jesus told that, man, you can remove the demon, but if you don't fill the house, if the house doesn't get a new resident, then he goes and gets 7 of his friends and comes and creates greater terror than he had before. And here, Judas knew Jesus. Judas walked with Jesus. Judas experienced Jesus. But Judas betrayed Jesus. That's weighty. How is it that you can experience all the miracles, all the life, walk with Jesus for these 3 years and not know him? It reminds me of in the very spot that Jesus was preaching and teaching his last week on this Holy Week was at the Mount of Olives, and where he did a lot of his ministry in Jerusalem. And one of his most famous sermons, the Sermon on the Mount, one part of that sermon he says, "Not all who call me Lord, Lord will enter the kingdom of heaven." Acknowledging Jesus, it does not necessitate that there's real faith. That is scary. Consider Judas, who experienced everything that Jesus was and everything that Jesus did, and yet he never had true faith. This is a moment to wake up and say, oh God, please don't let my faith be false. Oh God, please don't let my faith be fake. Don't let me trust in the experience of walking with you while at the same time not really trusting in you. You can know a lot about Jesus and never be saved by him. You can know a lot of sound doctrine and that doctrine never changes you. You can walk with Christ and not be saved. And this is a wake-up call. Oh God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And Satan knew the temptation that would get to Judas. I want you to think about this. Judas got this invitation to go and talk with the chief priests. He should have said no right away, but he entertained it. Do you think Judas went there to betray Jesus? Probably not. Probably not. But he's like, oh, they want to talk to me. Oh, they want to get my opinion. And he walks into this room. He finds himself in temptation that he should have fled and ran from, but he entertains the idea. I'll just talk with them. I won't do anything dumb. I'll just talk with them. And then he finds himself in a back room talking to the religious. I'll just hear what they have to say. I'll just see if their argument is rational. And he stayed there until eventually he was convinced by money. Judas sold Jesus out for chump change. The God of the universe sold for silver pennies. Unbelievable. And listen to how this ends in verse 6. So he, Judas, consented and sought an opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of a crowd. Judas was with Jesus. He gets convinced by money, and now it's on him to betray Jesus. He takes the initiative. How foolish we are to believe that we're safe from rejecting Christ, that we We've seen too much. We know too much. We are safe. We're not safe. Only the mercy of God keeps us safe. All the while Jesus is teaching about the kingdom of heaven, Judas is having a backroom conversation and giving himself over to the kingdom of man. This is Wednesday of Holy Week. Tomorrow's Passover. We'll see you then.